Hello class, welcome to week 10. It's hard to believe that this is the 2/3 point after this week. We will be 2/3 of the way through the semester. And we are beginning our last unit. The material that I'm covering this week actually spans what used to be 2 chapters in our textbook. So I have tried to streamline it. I'm going to also try to streamline the presentation of it. However, I really want you to hear the first 5 minutes of this video by Howard Goodall from the BBC.
Every melody. Complication.
I'm going to come back a little bit. Oh, here we go.
Music could be recorded. The story of music, successive waves of discoveries, breakthroughs, and inventions, is an ongoing process. The next great leap forward may take place in a back street of Beijing or upstairs in a pub in South Shields. Whatever music you're into, Monteverdi or Mantovani, Mozart or Motown, Masho or Mashup, the techniques it relies on didn't happen by accident. Someone somewhere thought of them first. Music can make us weep or make us dance. It's reflected the times in which it was written. It has delighted, challenged, comforted, and excited us. In this series, I've been tracing the story of music from scratch. To follow it on its miraculous journey, misleading jargon and fancy labels are best put to one side. Instead, try to imagine how revolutionary and how exhilarating many of the innovations we take for granted today were to people at the time. There are a million ways of telling the story of music. This is mine.
I really like how he uses regular language to describe music.
The later half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th saw the lives and careers of some of the giants of European music. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Mendelssohn, and Chopin. They lived through a time of tremendous social upheaval, the American and French revolutions, the Napoleonic Wars, and yet more revolutions. The turmoil of the times eventually saw music transformed. It became bigger, louder, and more ferocious. And yet, before around 1800, the remarkable fact is that the music doesn't reflect the mayhem that surrounded it. The period from around 1750 to 1850 brought with it seismic social, political, and artistic change. In music, faith and morality, the watchwords of Bach and Handel, gave way to the pleasure principle. Rather than trying to improve their listeners, composers like Haydn and Mozart started pampering them instead. And the rewards from their pampering completely transformed the social status of the composer. The process started with the dapper gentleman servant Haydn, soon morphed into the freelance star turn Mozart, and led to the tormented diva Beethoven. In just his lifetime, composers went from below stairs to high table. The whole function of music and the audience it was aimed at evolved, and evolved dramatically. The music of Haydn, Mozart, Schubert and their contemporaries is many things, but it is very rarely genuinely disturbing or unnerving. In their search for elegance, they produced a ton of music of great beauty, and in their search for sensuality, they made what might have been a grubby existence into something attractive, sensitive, and often very touching. And as the pleasure principle took hold amongst Europe's aristocracy, music turned from something morally rigorous or spiritually haunting to something sensual and intellectually unchallenging, even if it was often jolly stirring. But you could say there was a price to pay for this abstraction in music, a lack of meaning, and a lack of direct relevance to the times in which it was produced. Because Haydn and Mozart's obedient following of their favourite symphonic formulas could not have come at a more disobedient junction in history. The widespread panic that gripped the European aristocracy at the time of the American and French revolutions is, with some exceptions, very hard to detect in the bulk of the music. It's as if composers felt their job wasn't to join the revolutionaries, but keep the aristocracy calm. Don't panic, ladies and gentlemen. We'll create a virtual world of order and harmony in our symphonies and concertos. If you don't believe me, listen to this. It's what Haydn was writing, his 99th symphony, while the terror raged in Paris and they were cutting off the Queen's head. Whereas composers of previous centuries had on occasions produced music that seems to be a cry of lamentation, here the music sauntered blithely on. What happened to musical style then to reflect this change of attitude?
If you would like to see more of this, you can look it up on the internet, but we do have a lot of slides to get through. I just thought this might help give you all some context because we were beginning around 1750 with our new unit, and we will end up technically at the end of the classical era around 1820, but unfortunately we're not going to really cover Beethoven like I'd like to. That is in the next part of the class, the modern part of the class. So I am teaching it next semester online if you would like to take the class. So, classical style. It's all about proportion and balance. You noticed in those paintings that everything was very aesthetically, carefully presented, and it was inspired by classical antiquity. And this is illustrated in the period's architecture also, which is very symmetrical and reminiscent of some of the older monuments like the Pantheon. And there's a simplicity to it. The word classical comes from the Latin classicus, which is something of the best quality. This is a looking backward again. This happened a lot in the Renaissance, and we are looking back again to the classical era of antiquity. And technically the classical era of music, it should be called the neoclassical era. We are just going to call it classical. This was an important time in all of the arts and in visual arts also. We see the influence of the Greek and Roman classics and a return to the emphasis on the natural and nature, subjects in a nature setting. And there is a rejection of the solemnity and seriousness that was sometimes present during the Baroque. And eventually a rejection of the Rococo frivolity. That was the end of the Baroque era and the beginning of the classical era. Some of the paintings you saw were very Rococo. The lady on the swing, for instance, with the young man hiding in the bushes, kind of trying to peek up her dress. It was kind of almost silly, basically. But let's take a look at classical art and architecture. On the left, we have Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's building that it's actually his home that he built in Virginia. and remodeled to reflect more the Pantheon structure that he saw in Italy and was inspired by. In the middle, we have a portrait of Napoleon, and it's on a horse in a natural setting. And on the right, portraiture of the time seemed much more relaxed and less affected. We don't have these young ladies who are obviously of means, but we don't have them wearing a lot of jewelry or anything that is meant to impress. But there is a balance and symmetry of the Greek and Roman style present. My, how fashions change. This is a part of it. Take a look at the beginning of the Baroque era, or around the mid-Baroque era, around 1700. The gentlemen were powdering their faces and wearing wigs that were also powdered. They painted on beauty spots. And by 1800, where we see this family grouping, we can see how simply the ladies are dressed and how in much more relaxed fashion the man is dressed. He doesn't have a hat on. He doesn't have a wig on. This is obviously supposed to be a family relaxing at home, so he's even in a rather informal sort of jacket. But you can see it looks much more natural and simpler, and how kind of affected the portrait on the left is, which of course is just a drawing to show the fashion of the time. One of the reasons why men wore wigs was that, and ladies too, was that syphilis was running rampant starting in the 1500s. It was really the big new scourge in Europe, and it was something that the treatment was rather primitive for it, and usually men lost a lot of hair if they had syphilis. So a royal figure began wearing wigs to have a fuller head of hair, and soon it became the rage. And for about 200 years, men were expected to wear wigs, whether or not they really needed them. And they often kept their heads fairly shaved. And this was practical because there were also, because of the lack of frequent bathing and sanitary issues, they were always fighting things like lice, and it was much easier to send the wig out to be deloused and boiled at a shop than to have to worry about it in one's own hair. It's great to live now, in my opinion. So here's two works of art created 1400 years apart from each other. On the left, we see a tile mosaic, a boy child and his donkey, who is probably a pet, in Constantinople, 5th century. We can see an emphasis on the anatomy is correct, the perspective is correct, even the way that his little tunic sort of drapes over his body. It looks like a real person. The donkey looks close to 3D, and this is just a tile mosaic. But it was done 1400 years before Thomas Gainsborough, a famous portrait artist during the classical era, did this work of a boy and his dog. And you can see how the portrait of the boy and his dog, even though he is wearing more clothes, that it is in a nature setting. The dog looks almost 3D to me, as does the boy. So there's a lot of similarities in the styles of these, even though they were done 1400 years apart. Another important development during the classical era was the Enlightenment. This was an intellectual movement centered in France. And it was rooted in a faith in reason and science. Reason was advocated as the primary source and legitimacy for authority, perhaps for the first time in a long time in governments. If a government designed to protect its citizens' rights fails, it is okay to rebel against the government, was one of the underlying tenets. Members of the Enlightenment wrote treatises, serious articles, and books attacking social injustice and religious power that might be wielded over people in a heavy-handed way. The major figures of the Enlightenment were Voltaire and Rousseau, who are both pictured in the drawing. There was a pursuit of truth and following natural law. Scientific advances were discovered, and again, social justice, equality, tolerance, freedom of speech. Ultimately, this gave way to the Age of Revolution, which lasted all throughout the classical era. USA and the Enlightenment, the Declaration of Independence, and the Federalist Papers, which are important guiding papers for our government, were based on Enlightenment philosophy. The USA was a new state founded on rational principles, and it did feature an emphasis on human rights and the separation of church and state. The words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is from Enlightenment philosophy. The three branches of government idea came from a book by Montesquieu, who was a French Enlightenment author. Obviously, the document that was created was flawed and did not guarantee equality for everybody, but it is a dynamic document that we have been able to question and revise as a country, and we are gradually making things more and more equal for all people. Art and entertainment in this age, this was an age of good living, even though there were pockets of great unsettled activities, revolutions and things, but the people preferred to really focus on the rise of middle class entertainment, for instance, and the coffee house became a thing for the first time, and the salon where somebody of means might invite friends in to hear music on a regular basis. Intelligence, wit, and sensitivity was valued. Also, games like whist, which evolved into bridge, those were very popular. And the arts' place in all of this was that they were meant to entertain and to please, just as Howard Goodall was mentioning. We do have the rise of public concerts, which is prompted by the growing middle class. This proliferated throughout Europe and lent new importance to orchestral works. Composers began to write for public concerts. Haydn and Mozart both did that. Church and court patronage and opera houses are still important. And the opera houses had more and more regular people visiting them. A big change in opera was that people were finally weary of opera seria, which had persisted all throughout the Baroque era. Now we have the rise of comic opera. Opera buffa is what it's called. And middle-class values, everyday characters and situations were presented. Spoken dialogue sometimes occurred, and much simpler songs, slapstick comedy, and even bawdy humor. There was satire of pompous and incompetent aristocrats. However, the writers and the librettists had to carefully veil them because these had to still pass muster with the royal censors. It could not overtly make fun of the king, or if there was a moment where the king was being made fun of, in the end things did need to resolve to make the king look good. During this era, the harpsichord is dethroned. The piano gradually replaced the harpsichord. We still hear it throughout classical opera because it's an instrument that could support the voices in recitatives without overpowering them. But more and more, the piano, which was invented around 1700, and we see an early piano style here, looks similar to the harpsichord, produced many dynamic contrasts and more colors than the harpsichord could produce. These were played by amateurs in the home, especially women, as well as professionals. Classical style featured short, simple melodies. These melodies were easy to sing. They had frequent cadences and featured antecedent and consequent phrases. Antecedent and consequent phrases are, it's funny, this is not the slide I wanted. Okay, I was going to get rid of that slide. Antecedent and consequent phrases have some typical features. The antecedent phrase is the opening, incomplete sounding phrase. The consequent phrase brings repose and closure, sort of at least a resting point. The phrases share similar rhythms and motives, and the phrases balance each other. So here's a Mozart melody, and it's divided into antecedent and consequent parts. So I will try to sing it for you. Da da dum be da 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 dum. Da da dum da da dum da 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 dum da 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 dee da da dee da dum ba da dum da dee dum ba da dum bum. So the second part has more a feeling of something is done, and we are expecting more, but you notice that they are exactly the same length beat-wise, and they have, in this case, an exact replica of rhythm, but slight difference in the actual pitches. Harmony. There's an irregular rate of harmonic change. The changes happen more rapidly at cadences, particularly. There's fluid, flexible harmonic rhythm, meaning the chords are changing and undulating, changing underneath the melody. But these are simple chords. There is a technique called Alberti bass that is very popular on the piano and enlivens a passage of static harmony. So if a composer was going to stay on one chord for a while, it made it sound,
is the best way to learn this and
it
master
made it
the
sound
piano.
less boring.
Just play along with any piano or keyboard.
So
Musician
here's a
listens to
brief
you play and gives
demonstration of
instant
Alberti
feedback on
bass.
accuracy and timing. Fun and addictive.
Hi, today I'd like to cover a technique of classical music called the Alberti bass. Alberti was a composer. I think he died when he was 30 years old. Lived in the 1700s, and he used this style a great deal. But subsequent, a lot of composers like Mozart used it after him. For example, well, let me just show you what it is first of all. You take any chord like this, any three-note chord, and you can make a pattern out of it by playing bottom, top, middle, top, bottom, top, middle, top. And that's all there is to it. If it was a G chord, you play bottom, top, middle chord. If you have a four-note chord, such as G7th, you'll have to leave one note out. You can go bottom, top, and middle, top, or bottom, top, middle, top. Doesn't matter which one you play. It just has to be a chord note, okay? If you were on C, it would be bottom, top, middle, top, bottom, top, middle, top. They can be used to a great, as I said, Mozart used it a great deal, but other composers have as well. For example, if you were playing Away in a Manger, you could get a nice music box sound by playing. Gotta be careful your hands don't run together like mine just did. I'll move it down. I'm gonna let it whine.
All right, friends, so that is a wonderful demonstration of Alberti bass, named after Domenico Alberti. Rhythm. It contrasts with Baroque style in a big way. That driving rhythm from the end of the Baroque era is gone, and there's a much greater variety of rhythm within a single movement. Even within these few bars here that you can see, we start out with steady eighth notes and eighth note chords, dotted quarters underneath, longer, and then some bo-dee-do-dee-do, some little short rhythms, and then it changes up here, be-da-dum, dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, really fast notes, and then eighths with 16ths. So there's a lot of variety just within these 8 bars of music. This is a portrait of Nannerl Mozart, and we know that she was a composer, but she was not a famous composer like her brother, and none of the music that she composed actually survives, although we have some comments about her music from her brother saying that it was fantastic. The texture of classical music, it's mostly homophonic, so that means one melody going on at a time, and the other lines are supporting it. They're not in competition with it, they're supporting it. It's light and transparent. The texture you just heard of the Away in the Manger is homophonic. Even though that Alberti bass is rather busy, it's all chords that are underpinning and supporting the melody. There's a rather thin bass and middle range, and counterpoint, or sometimes when we have polyphonic texture, is used sparingly and mainly for contrast, and often there is a little part of or bit of a movement of a symphony or a quartet that actually will go into a fugue, which is very contrapuntal. Form, we use a few standard forms that regulate much of classical music, such as sonata allegro form, which is outlined on the bottom, rondo form, theme and variations, minuet and trio, and so forth. Color. The orchestra is increasing in size. A regular orchestra is increased to 50 to 60 musicians, perhaps. The strings remain the core of the orchestra, although technology begins assisting the orchestra instruments as far as making the instruments sound stronger. Also, metal strings replace those of gut. I have sometimes heard performances on gut strings, and they're very difficult to keep in tune. The woodwinds, the full woodwind ensemble is standard at this point, including flute, oboe, and bassoon. The clarinet is invented around 1710 in Germany and did not necessarily spread quickly throughout Europe. Mozart first heard it in 1778 when he went to Mannheim and heard an orchestra there, and he was really jazzed about it. He loved it and promptly started putting it into his orchestra parts, and he even wrote a concerto for clarinet. The picture down below shows a clarinet from around the early classical era. In the brasses, the color of the orchestra features only French horns or trumpets in the beginning of the classical era. Technology had not yet solved the problem of certain instrumental groups sounding in tune together until around 1800, when we begin to see more a bigger variety of brass instruments joining the orchestra. The tuba hasn't been invented yet, mind you. And trombone is used for the first time in Beethoven's Third Symphony, so still not in the early part of the classical era. Percussion is only included on special occasions. Here is, of course, a modern-day orchestra, but they're dressed much like an orchestra would have been dressed in the classical era, and they feature the costumes of the time. Opera in the classical era is going to be our last item that we actually explore a lot together in week 14, but you actually do have a listening guide in this chapter from The Marriage of Figaro, one of my favorite operas. It happens to be by Mozart, and it's an opera buffa. The story pokes fun at Count Almaviva, and so it features subversive social values to the time. The stars, instead of being the royals or the important people, the countess and the count, they are the count's servants, Susanna and Figaro. Figaro is Count Almaviva's butler, and Susanna is the countess's maid. Figaro learns that the count wants to seduce his fiancée, Susanna, and the clever valet vows to put his morally bankrupt employer in his place. You can see that the plot is going to poke fun at the Count, and so they had to work hard to make a story that everybody ends up happy in the end, and the Count ends up looking like a swell guy in the end. But at the beginning, we see somebody who is not faithful to his wife and is rather despicable in some of his actions. This aria is called Se vuol ballare, if you want to dance. And it's translated, if you wish to dance, my dear Count, it is I who will call the tune. If you come to my school, I'll be the teacher. Note the balanced phrases and simple, straightforward rhythm in contrast to the florid, Baroque operatic lines. And listen also for the courtly minuet dance feel of the music. The libretto is in Italian, which was popular at the time. So we're going to hear this scene with Erwin Schrott, baritone. And just to set it up a little more, Susanna has just told him that the master plans to claim his droit de seigneur, which is an ancient practice where the master of the manor can actually take one of his servants to his bedchamber and have his way with her because he is the master of her. And it doesn't matter if she wants to be married to somebody else. And it's a pretty ancient and despicable right. And the character of Figaro is plotting at this moment. He's angry, but he's plotting how he's going to navigate through this and bring the Count around and save the virtue of his fiancée. So here's the end of the recitative, and now the aria.
Se vuol ballare, signor contino, il chitarrino le suonerò. Il chitarrino le suonerò, sì, le suonerò, sì, le suonerò. Se vuol venire nella mia scuola a Capriona, insegnerò. Se vuol venire nella mia scuola a Capriona, insegnerò, sì, insegnerò, sì, insegnerò. Saprò, ma piano.
You can sense his anger, but he realizes he has to be careful.
L'arte adoperando, dico pungendo, di là scherzando, tutte le macchine rovescerò. L'arte scrivendo, l'arte adoperando, dico pungendo, di là scherzando, tutte le macchine rovescerò. Tutte le macchine rovescerò. Tutte le macchine rovescerò.
The form is balanced, this comes back, same as the beginning. Oh, one of my favorite operas. All right. Now we're going to talk about Haydn and Mozart a little bit. They overlapped, although Haydn was older He was born before Mozart was, and he actually died after Mozart died, so he did have a longer life than Mozart. They played string quartets together in Vienna and admired each other. We need to talk a little bit about the Viennese school, which this is also in your ebook. The Viennese classical style was the gold standard in this part of music history, and careers of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert all unfolded in Vienna, and their music radiated outward from there to all points in Europe. And so you can see it's kind of on the east side, it's central, but a very influential city. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just a random thing, but it was an important city. It was the capital city of the old Holy Roman Empire, the administrative center for the Austrian Empire, so it was the capital. It was a cultural crossroads for Central Europe, and often there were even influences from the east because of trade routes. It was the fourth largest city in Europe. It was a wealthy city with aristocratic patrons. They supported many composers. They attended public and private concerts and hosted them in their homes. They employed them as music teachers for their children and their wives. Many amateur performers were present in Vienna in this highly educated music environment. It was a profitable market for music teachers and publishers. These knowledgeable and appreciative audiences were hungry for the latest work for piano, for instance, from Herr Haydn. Concerts and theaters in the streets in summertime were prevalent. There were elaborate balls with 2,000 couples. It was quite the cultural center. Here's the timeline of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. So you can see Haydn was born in 1732, Mozart in 1756. And then Mozart died in 1791, and Haydn died in 1809. And Beethoven was born in 1770, later than Mozart, and then he died in 1827. A little bit more particulars about Haydn. He was born in a small Austrian village, and he was heard singing in a boys' choir in that village by a visiting music professional from Vienna, and he was recruited to become a choir boy at St. Stephen's Church in Vienna at the age of 8. You might not have heard of St. Stephen's Choir, but have you ever heard of the Vienna Choir Boys? This is that choir, although this was an earlier version of the choir. He was educated in this environment, and he was taught harpsichord and violin. But by age 17, he was caned and put out on the streets after a prank. He cut off the pigtail of a fellow chorister. They were probably looking for an excuse to get rid of him anyway, because 17 is getting to be pretty old for a choral boy choir member, and the voice is dropping and not as valuable as that high soprano voice with the pure sound. And he was probably fairly expensive to feed at that point, so they really didn't care so much what happened to him. He was taken in by a friend for a few months, kind of the equivalent of ending up on somebody's couch. I don't know if you've ever done that for somebody or been in that position yourself. He had very precarious finances. He studied composition and eked out what he called a wretched existence for the next 10 years. He was learning and he was composing, but nobody really cared about it until his opera, The Limping Devil, was a brief success. It was one of those operas that made fun of the aristocracy, and so the censors actually ended up shutting it down. But it was something that was enough of a sensation for him to begin creating a name for himself. During this time, he married Aloysia Keller, the sister of Therese, whom he loved. So it was an unhappy marriage. Both of them ended up taking lovers. but they never divorced. His big break was in 1761. Prince Esterházy, pictured on the right, was a very influential prince in Vienna, and he became his musical servant. He was his Kapellmeister, his chapel master. He wrote for the court, the church. He wrote operas for him, string quartets, masses, symphonies. These compositions originally were owned by the prince. However, pirated copies were circulating around, and it was obvious to Haydn that he was being taken advantage of. So a future contract, he actually was able to negotiate having artistic rights over the music so that he could sell them to the public. He had a long association with the Esterházys, and you can see on the lower left, that is their castle that was in Vienna. And then on the top and right, you can see elaborate gardens and another castle, which was actually out in the country. And that was where the Esterházy family retreated for the summers. This was back when cholera epidemics were rampant in the summertime. And even though they had some ideas about correlations between the sickness and what might be causing it, all they knew for certain was that people who had access to clean air and water tended to not get sick. So that is one of the reasons why they retreated to the countryside for the summer, before better sanitary sewers and so forth. His reputation was he was loved very much throughout Austria, and he was called affectionately Papa Haydn. He was the head of an orchestra and sort of their father in a way, and he was an influential creator of the mature classical style. He solidified the string quartet genre and wrote over 80 quartets. He wrote 104 symphonies and introduced theme and variations into the symphony genre. After the death of Prince Esterházy, the son of Prince Esterházy really wasn't needing as much music from Haydn, and he was released from most of his obligations to the Esterházy family. And there was a man who was called an impresario, sort of like an agent, and he came to Vienna as soon as he heard Prince Esterházy died, and he told him that if he would go to England for a visit, it would be lucrative for him, and that the people of London were clamoring for his music. So he visited London twice, 1791 and 92. He was there during that span, and then again 1794 and 95. These were highly successful trips, and he returned to Vienna with the equivalent of $1.2 million in today's money. He was treated as a celebrity. He received an honorary degree from Oxford, met the king and queen. This is quite a different existence from the Haydn who wore servant's livery and worked as in basically he was in service to the prince and his family. He composed the 12 London symphonies during his time in London, and the typical audience size for his concerts were 800 to 900 people, which I imagine would have packed out some of the smaller halls. His music featured a large orchestra of 50 or 60 players.
Britain, in the second half of the 18th century, bestrode the globe. Enormously rich, enormously powerful. But what we failed to produce during this time was a national composer of real genius. We were, however, and continue to be, a nation of anthem lovers. We British naturally create songs that we can all wrap our lungs around, which tap into the public mood and somehow draw us together. it or loathe it, Rule Britannia has been a firm part of British national identity since the 1740s, the decade that also saw the birth of our other big national tune. So, two iconic tunes, but no great national composer. And once again, the man that became our national musical hero at the end of the 18th century was, like Handel before him, a foreigner. He came from Austria, and his name was Franz Joseph Haydn. And he wrote this. The Austrian imperial anthem, subsequently adopted by the Germans. Let's face it, they got the better tune. But Britain's relationship with Haydn really was a two-way street. We caused a seismic shift in his composition, and he took our musical destiny forwards. Haydn arrived in Britain on New Year's Day 1791, the first of two substantial visits he made here. He was already revered internationally as the world's greatest composer, and yet he'd spent his entire working life closeted away in the service of noble princes on the Hungarian border. And only now, at the age of nearly 60, did he have the opportunity to travel independently. The world was his oyster, but it was Britain he chose to come to. In 1791, this country was more progressive, open, free, and rich than any other in Europe. And interestingly, economic, political, and cultural power was in the process of shifting from the aristocracy and the church to the new, confident and swelling middle class.
So, again, this is something you could look up if you'd like to hear more of, but it gives us a little bit of context again, which I think is very helpful. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born in 1756, died in 1791. He was born to a musical family in Salzburg, which was and is a smaller town that is somewhat distant from Vienna. His older sister, Nannerl, began studying keyboard with their father at age 7. The 3-year-old Wolfgang was mesmerized and often hid underneath the piano listening to the lessons. He would stay on at the clavier after the lessons, playing what he'd heard. Clavier is German for piano. He displayed an extraordinary talent at an early age in piano and violin, and was already composing simple works by the age of 5. His full name is above: Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart, his full baptismal name. He was the most famous child prodigy in history. The parents trotted Wolfgang and Nannerl around Europe to play for royalty, but there was a negative effect on young Mozart's health, and overall constitution is suspected. The first tour was 3 years long, and there were no luxury type accommodations for travel. Even being in a carriage, which seems all right, in the middle of winter, which is cold, and the dampness would creep in, and it was bumpy, and this was his mode of transportation all around Europe. He took position with court in Salzburg at age 17, working basically for the archbishop, and he hated being in servitude as a court musician. He had an oppressive stage dad who was trying to micromanage his career. His name is Leopold. He also was a composer, but not nearly as famous as his son. And he, of course, had been his first teacher. He ended up as a freelance musician in Vienna against his dad's wishes. His father wanted him to have the the steady income that he could have gotten, much as Haydn had, if he had remained in service to a royal.
My son was hailed by all of Vienna, not only as a great pianist, but as one of the greatest and most controversial composers of his time. But I saw it first. I nurtured that talent in him. I had helped him become what he now was.
On a stormy evening in February 1785, the elite of Vienna gathered to hear a new work from Austria's leading virtuoso pianist, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The importance of what lay within this masterpiece was known to only one man, Leopold Mozart, the composer's estranged father. I believe Mozart is the greatest composer of all time. The popular view was that he was born a genius straight from his mother's womb. But in my opinion, his brilliance grew and developed from the loves and losses during his brief 35 years. Life was the driving force of his genius. In this series, I want to discover, helped by the true accounts of those who knew him firsthand and following in his footsteps, how Mozart's own suffering and joy created music so powerful that it captivates the listener today, just as it did that first audience more than 200 years ago. Mozart was born into a musical family. His father Leopold was the author of a famous manual on violin playing and deputy director of music to the Archbishop of Salzburg.
What do you think the outcome will be, Herr Sanctus?
I can assure you, Herr Mozart, the Archbishop is delighted with your composition. I heard him say so. And that his violinists will have to study them closely by Ascension Day.
Leopold's family was small but...
Again, this is just a brief introduction into a documentary about Mozart, which you can follow up on if you are interested in more details about his life. He's about ready to go on tour in that part of the movie for the first time. On a visit to Germany, Mozart fell in love with Aloysia Weber. She did not love him, however, and she refused his affections. He ended up marrying her sister, Constanze Weber. So there's a big similarity between Mozart and Haydn in that they both ended up marrying the sister of the woman they loved. Although, by all accounts, Mozart and his wife were happy with each other, they didn't necessarily make the best match for being good partners financially. One of them needed to have more sense around money than they actually had. The couple had 2 children that survived childhood and constant money woes. Despite periodic triumphs, remember he was a freelance musician, so he didn't have a steady salary. So if he would have a tremendous success with an opera or something, he would have a whole lot of money at once, which they would proceed to throw parties and blow very quickly. So they weren't very responsible with money, we know that. He received international fame as a composer. and also as a talented performer. And they overspent for their income. They had a lively social circle in Vienna and a house that featured several pets, a canary, a starling, a dog, and a horse. He was underemployed his entire life. The jobs he was offered either bored or insulted him. He was in some ways a little bit ahead of his time, I guess you could say, because Beethoven was able to make a better living as a freelance musician than Mozart was. He was possibly the greatest musical genius the world has ever known. His compositions display diversity, breadth of expression, and perfect formal control that is only matched by the works of J.S. Bach. And what happened to Sister Nannerl? She was given top billing on the first European tour as the older sibling, and she was left at home for the second tour. The problem was, at this point in her life, she was at a marriageable age, and there were many prejudices against women. It was okay for a child to be clever, but not a woman. And her father needed her to teach piano lessons to help finance the tour because they weren't able to finance it completely from the gifts that they received for performances from royalty and from the money that they received. It was expensive, and they were having to live on the road for months and months. So after puberty, it was not safe to show her off. For example, if she's so wonderful at playing the piano, there must be a reason. Perhaps she's a witch. And this might seem silly to you, but there was, the year of Mozart's birth, a 12-year-old girl burned at the stake in Europe for being suspected of being a witch. So it was just as much the family wanting to protect her as anything. The father grew angry about Nannerl composing music and ordered her to stop. She was totally subservient to her father. Remember, he was overbearing and micromanager. And she wanted to marry for love, but she was an obedient daughter and married a magistrate, a widower, as her father had ordered. She raised his 5 children, and they had 3 more together. The older husband died in 1801, and she returned to Salzburg and taught piano lessons until her death. So, did we get to the whole thing? We did. Wonderful. So, thank you for your kind attention. I am so sorry this took so long, but as I said, this was the combination of 2 chapters. So thank you for your kind attention, and good luck through this wonderful last unit of the semester.